My name is James Blair. I'm here to talk to you about a program called Gertty. I work for a company called Red Hat, which works for a company called IBM. I work on a program called Zool, which comes out of the OpenStack project, where we're big believers in code review, especially this tool that we use called Gerrit, which looks exactly like this. By the way, that was 8 slides in 8 seconds. So I'm the anti-Monty today. We'll get through this in no time. So this is actually not quite what Gerrit looks like today, but it is what Gerrit looks like when I started using it. Shortly after I started using it, it looked like this, which is completely different, as you can see. And it stayed looking like this for a long time. We were able to I guess, get some of our minor cosmetic changes merged upstream in Gerrit, but some of our more radical ideas about alternate workflows, rightly, we got some pushback from because some of these things don't belong in upstream Gerrit. So around the time that Gerrit added support started adding a REST API, I thought, well, maybe I can implement some of these workflow ideas in an alternate user interface to Gerrit. And so I started working on this program that I eventually called Gertty. There were 4 big reasons that I wrote Gertty, and these are still sort of the guiding principles of Gertty today. Reason number 1 is, as I alluded to, workflow. This is a screenshot of my mail and news reader. It's mostly my mail reader these days. There are not many news groups left to read, sadly. But you can see all of these mailing lists, and there are more that I'm ignoring. But I'm ignoring them very efficiently. It makes it very easy to subscribe to a lot of mailing lists, filter those mails into the right folders, and dispose of them quickly in whatever way you see fit, whether that's reading them, marking them all as read, or just ignoring them, as apparently I do here. But I really like the workflow provided by mail and news readers. This idea that you get a bunch of messages that you can go through quickly, you can triage, you can save for later, you can mark them as read, all of these things. And I kind of wanted that workflow for code review, and Gerrit internally provides some of those things, but not quite at the scale that I was looking for. Reason number 2, offline use. I travel a lot, as you may be able to tell from my accent. I have traveled to be here today. In fact, that's approximately the location that I spent about 10 hours of misery in to get here. But I'm very happy that I'm here now. But when my office is in that location, I would like to still be able to perform code review. And so I wanted a system that worked completely offline. I also wanted to be useful for my friend Monty, who travels even more than I do. So he gets to, this is his office. Reason number 3, speed. A lot of our developers are spread throughout the world, and we have one Gerrit server, and it's located in Dallas, Texas. So if you're in Dallas, Texas, it's great, and if you're in New Zealand, it's not. This is a schematic map of the submarine cables of the internet. I believe it's extremely accurate. And as you can see, the United States and New Zealand are very far apart on this map. As they are on most maps. And so our friends in New Zealand actually particularly took to this idea because it actually improved their interaction with Gerrit, because they're able to, Gertty will work in a completely offline mode. It will also mask some of the inherent delays in working with Gerrit, even if you're online, but at the end of a very long cable. And finally, reason number 4 is convenience. I like text terminals. I think they're great for dealing with text. Source code is text, and so there are all these things that you can do if your code review tool is running locally. You can tell your code review tool to check out changes into your local repository, run these commands directly there. It provides a whole new level of convenience that is difficult to get by using a web application. So I guess when I was about a few months old, Digital Equipment Corporation released the VT100, which to this day is the terminal that terminal emulators emulate. And that was me and VT100 to scale at the time. They have, however, changed a little bit since then. They can do things like this now. I believe it's perfectly reasonable for me to show you vacation snapshots. For instance, you might recognize the Fish Church from here in town. Let's see, you zoom out, and actually resolution gets a little better, right? My wife Lee went and visited the island of Brano the other day. This is a shot from her lovely walk on the island. It's beautiful, isn't it? You feel like you're there, right? Let's see, let's make this bigger again. So, but let's take a minute and talk about REST APIs, because REST APIs are the thing that makes this all possible. Whoops. No, not that one. Sorry. There we go. So what is an API? The cow is telling you very important things about an API. There will be a quiz later. But in computer programming, an application programming interface is a set of routines, protocols, and tools for building software applications. So what is REST? Well, REST was described in a paper, I can't remember if it was a master's or a doctoral thesis several years ago, and these are the characteristics of an API that make it a REST API. It needs to be a client-server API that allows clients and servers to be developed independently. This is obviously key for things like Gertty, and it's the thing that sort of revolutionized development with polyGerrit. It allowed polyGerrit to be developed completely independently from Gerrit itself, which is a wonderful way of doing development. Stateless, no client context should be stored on the server between requests. That doesn't mean there's no session context. It just means that you need to be careful about where you put it and how you use it. The API should be cacheable. It should be a layered systems, so clients may not assume that they're connected directly to the server. There may be intermediate proxy servers, that sort of thing. Code on demand. This is one we don't hear about very often, but in the original paper it said that the servers might provide code to clients that they could then extend themselves with and run. This is an optional part of being a REST API. And finally, there's the uniform interface. The uniform interface means that that resources are individually defined, identified, and addressable. Those resources can be manipulated by altering the representation of them. Messages should be self-descriptive. That means they contain enough information for clients to process them. As an example, MIME type. And then this thing called hypermedia as the engine of application state, or I don't know how you pronounce that. Hadios? Hypermedia is the engine of application state. So what is this idea? This is the idea that if you have a server and you want to perform actions on it, then those actions should all be defined in terms of hypermedia. So here's the server, which we can reboot, delete, or snapshot. Oh, I'm, of course, using the wonderful red typeface for this. Those lines you can't read say reboot, delete, and snapshot. And those are links to other parts of the REST API that allow you to perform those state transitions. And the idea is that by putting these links here in in the hypertext, then you're exposing the state transitions as something that any client can understand. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, a lot of these things are unfamiliar to me, and I sure don't see them in Gerrit's REST API, and you'd be right. And they're lacking from many REST APIs, because the thing that we call a REST API may not actually be, according to this paper, a REST API. So if you look at what's required here, almost everything that I talked about, except for code on demand, is required in order for something to be a REST API. In order to implement an effective remote client for a system, you don't need very many of those. You just need the client server bit, and you need the identification bit. And in fact, you really don't want the code on demand bit, because if we started shipping JavaScript to Gerrit to tell it to run new things based on somebody clicking a button in the UI, one, we'd have to have a serious talk about security, and two, that would be really hard for clients like Gertty to implement, since it's not written in JavaScript. So in fact, there is at least one thing that's optionally part of the REST API definition that you really don't want if you want third-party clients to your systems. But that's okay. I think at this point, the thing that we call a REST API, language moves on. I think we're going to keep calling it that, whether it is or is not. Technically, what it really is it's a protocol. And as the CAL says, in telecommunications, a communication protocol is a system of digital rules for data exchange within or between computers. That's what we're talking about here. These are a couple of my favorite protocols. This one, a lot of people dislike, but I kind of like it. It's got tagged responses. So, you can issue a bunch of commands and it'll come back later and tell you which one succeeded and failed. SMTP is the source of everything that's wonderful in our mailboxes. It's a little long in the tooth, but it's really easy to interact with. You can type commands at it and it'll talk back. In fact, it even says hello. And then, of course, we have the HTTP plus JSON protocol, which is really what everybody, we call this REST. But that's what it really is. It's a HTTP plus JSON protocol, and it's lovely. It's maybe not quite as simple or as user-friendly as SMTP, but what it lacks there, it makes up in parsability, which is fantastic. So when I started working on Gertty, I had some choices with toolkits. I wanted to write this in Python because that's the language that I work most quickly in. And there were a bunch of toolkits for Python. I looked at these and found that they were interesting, but Erwid really caught my attention because it was most like the graphical user interface libraries that I was familiar with from other languages. So despite the fact that I keep talking to you about terminal applications, I have done my fair share of GUI programming. I know what widgets are and things like that. This is a Hello World program in Gertty, in Erwid. You can see it's pretty small, it's easy to use, it's starting to look like things you might see in a regular GUI program. There's a text widget, and it goes inside of a filler widget, and then there's a main loop that displays all these things and handles user interaction. The widgets, they sort of stack up like this. They have funny names, but they correspond very much to things from other toolkits. So there's a pile, which is a vertical container of things, and columns is a horizontal container of things, and list box is a scrollable container of things. So all of these ideas show up in Erwid, and it makes writing an application like Gertty pretty easily. And there's one final thing that I want to talk about before I show you what Gertty looks like. That is the visual design. As humans in the science of perception, there's a lot of really fascinating things going on about how our eyes actually go about reading text, how we scan large amounts of information to pull out what we're looking for. Shapes are a big part of that, and so you can probably look at this and pull out some relevant information just by the shape of the text. But color can be a very important aspect too. So here's the same screen with some color to help draw your eyes to the important things. So these are all important things that I think that need to be considered when working on a system like Gertty, and are a big part of how I made it. So if you'll give me just a moment, I'm going to press some buttons on my screen to make this a mirror so that we're all looking at the same thing. Yeah, and I will show you. I'll show you a demo now. So, let me embiggen this one a little bit too, and maybe do that. Okay, so actually, funnily enough, when you start Gertty, it's pretty much the same thing that happens when you start Gerrit. You get a blank screen, which, as we've all learned, is unintuitive for users. So much like Gertty also, if it detects that that condition has happened, it pops up a little window explaining the idea of subscription to you. So this is the first workflow from newsgroups idea put into practice. You can subscribe to projects in Gertty. So this Gertty is pointed at the OpenDev system, which has about 2,000 Git repositories in it. I am not interested in very many of those, so I've subscribed to the ones that I'm interested in. And in addition to subscriptions, it has this idea of topics, so I can open up the under the Zool topic, I've got all of these Zool-related repos. Under OpenStack, I have not very many at this point. I have a couple of repos that are outside of topics altogether. So these are all the projects I'm interested in, and so Gertty tries to keep all of these things in sync. It shows me how many unreviewed and open changes there are. As you can see, I've been ignoring changes extremely efficiently, and so this almost looks like the screen where I was ignoring all those emails earlier. So mission accomplished there, as far as that goes. When I say in sync, by the way, I really mean in sync. Every one of these projects that are listed here in this Gertty, there is a Git clone of that project on the local file system, and every one of these changes has been fetched from Gertty and is put into the local Git repository with its actual refs, changes, whatever ref on it. So if I wanted to, I could open up a terminal right now and git show refs, changes, yada, 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 and actually see that change by looking at the local ref. But in addition to keeping everything in sync on the file system, it has a local database of changes which it keeps in sync with Gerrit's metadata about changes, so that things like searching and whatnot happen pretty quickly as well. So if we pick one of these projects and we open it up, we can see a list of 247 unreviewed changes in Zool. Most of these things, as you can see over in the right-hand column, that's workflow -1, which in our system, because we're on Gerrit 2.13 and not 3.0, really means work in progress. So these are things that if I tweaked this query a little bit, I could actually get rid of fairly quickly, but I didn't bother to do that here, so you see everything. So this is a list of a bunch of changes. One of the things that I'm particularly proud of in Gertty and use all the time is threading. So again, an idea from email, newsgroups, etc. Gerrit is fantastic for stacking up changes on top of each other. Sometimes it can be a little bit much to keep in your head, and so here's a visual display of what changes depend on what other changes. And so you can see that it's mostly a long series, but actually there's a little fork in it, that sort of thing. We've got a couple more of those throughout this list. Let's see, what else? The change screen. So let's look at the change screen. Let me back it out a little bit so that it shows up in 2 columns. This is how I normally use it. I'm sorry if the type is maybe a little small to read now, but this this looks very much like the original change screen from Gerrit, because aside from the colors, the information design on that screen was actually really good. And if you take a step back, a lot of the things that were good about the first change screen's information design are showing up again in the PolyGerrit UI, and I think that's great because we're getting a good in PolyGerrit we're getting a good UI that is pleasant to use and has good information design with some pretty proven ideas in it. So there are a couple of sections to this screen. There's the information about the change up in the left. There's the commit message up on the right. There's I've pulled out information about the jobs that have run here. Eventually this will turn into the checks API. And over here are comments about the change. And this one isn't a great change for sharing comments. So let's see if there's another. Oh, so back to the idea of workflow from email. If you want to go through a bunch of changes quickly, you can open something up and hit the N key for next, and it'll go through the list that you were on. That's also something that is present in the Gerrit web interface, but it's very convenient for running through a lot of changes. So here's a change with some comments. And let's see. We also have inline comments showing up there. If we look at the diff view, this, by the way, is a, let's find another change with more files. So this is a, the diff view is side by side by default. You can also do unified diff if you want, and it's all in one page diff view. So here we've got the commit message followed by one file, followed by, here's the boundary for a second file. It always shows you the current file at the top. And then down here, here's a release note. And here's another file after that. So it's pretty easy to add new comments. Just hit enter on the line. You can add comments on the old side and on the new, that sort of thing. Let's see, I'll clear that out so I don't confuse people. Let me find a change with more than one patch out there. So if we're looking at the diff view here, you can see that we're by default showing the diff from base to patch set 3, which is the latest. I added a key so that you can very quickly do the interpatch set diff. So this is now showing patch set 2 to 3, and we can go from 1 to 2. It makes switching between those fairly easy, and of course you can pop up a little window to select whichever one you want. So if you want to do diff from 1 to 3, you can do it there. Let's see. Oh, going back to information design, here's the conflicting changes on the left. So if you've uploaded a change, you can see what changes might conflict with it or what other people are potentially working on similar areas of the code. And let me go back to this change. This is an interesting change. It just adds a release note. So again, continuing the theme of release notes, we merged a change to Zool that fixed a bug, which didn't seem very important at the time. Then it sort of occurred to us, actually, this is maybe something we should let people know about. So this just adds a release note there. There's an idea in Gertty called review keys, where you can map hotkeys to commonly used review actions. So if I wanted to have, leave a +1 on this change, I can hit Alt-1 and it will leave a +1. It turns out this change is actually ready to merge, so I'm going to hit Alt-3. No, I'm not going to hit Alt-3. I guess I'm going to hit. Yeah, I don't actually use this. This apparently is the first time I've Alt-3'd on this machine. So I'll have to do it the old-fashioned way. But you saw Alt-1, which quickly left a +1. So this is going to leave a +2 code review and approved vote. And this change will go get merged now. You'll notice as I perform actions like this, there's a little counter up in the top right that says sync. When it's at 0, it means everything's in sync. When it has a number and it's counting down, that means that something is different between the local database and Gerrit, and it is either pulling something down or pushing something up. So might be able to see that change as I perform actions. Gertty has dashboards, so you can configure these as any arbitrary query. I have, let's see, yeah, oh, here's the dashboard for Gerrit User Summit 2019. So this brings up all of the changes that that we've been pushing up related to work that we did here at the hackathon. And this is just a dashboard that I configured with this search query, topic Gus 2019. Gertty implements the syntax that's identical to Gerrit's search interface, but it does everything locally. So it's just implementing the same Lucene style keyword searching on its local database. So I can modify this to say, status open, that sort of thing. And they're all still open, so it's the same set, but you get the idea. Starred changes are supported. So here are some changes that I've previously starred. This is, of course, synced with Gerrit starred changes, so it's pretty easy to hop between the different systems here, and you just hit star to either star or unstar them. That's pretty intuitive. Here's something that I was able to do with Gertty, which I don't know how difficult it would be to do with Gerrit itself. This is recently seen changes. So every time you open up a change in Gertty, it notices, it updates a timestamp. And so what I can do here is it's currently showing me every change that I've looked at in the past 24 hours. So when you start switching around between changes a lot and you're like, I know I just had a tab open with something, this helps you find it. And then finally, well, not finally, the penultimate feature that I want to show you is the process mark. So if we go back to, let's say, Zool, and we have a bunch of changes, and I don't know, we wanted to, here's 2 changes from Monty, which we love all changes from Monty, so we just want to approve them all without even reviewing them. You can hit the process mark key, and oh look, here's another one. Oops. Yeah. You can hit the process mark key, and you see how they're highlighted here. In blue. So now if you do something like hit R to review, you can review all of these changes at once. This is perhaps not so useful for the thing that I just described. However, it does come in handy when you want to abandon a bunch of changes to a branch that you're closing, or occasionally if you've got a bunch of changes which have been they're in review and you know that they're all good and they're just waiting for the right time to merge, like some maintenance event or something like that, then you can mark them all with process mark and perform batch operations on them. All right, and the final thing that I wanted to show you is some operations on local repositories. So, for instance, I can put my cursor over a change and check it out. So I've now checked out David's change to store auto hold requests in Zookeeper. I can start rebuilding his patch series in the same order. I can go down and I can hit the X key to cherry pick this change on top of it, and then this change on top of that, and maybe I decide that this one should go after that. And so now I've done that. This can be really handy when you're working with patch series and you need to rebase them or put them in a different order or something like that. And of course, now this is my local checkout now. So if I open up a terminal and I go to git zool, I get log, you'll see that mark nodes as used is the current commit that's checked out. So it's very easy to switch from doing something in manipulating your Git repository in Gertty and then switching to local Git operations. And I'm sure I've left things out. So what? Mark as seen. Oh yes. So one of so right now this is showing me all of my unreviewed changes. If I review them, they'll go away. In fact, down here at the bottom, you can see that change that I reviewed to add the release note. That's gone. That was actually the last change in the list. It's not here anymore. If I tell Gertty to show me every change, you'll see that it shows back up again. Add release note to bug fix, right? Now, if I, all of these changes up here, let's say I don't want to see them anymore. Let's tell Gertty that I've reviewed them. I can hit a key to mark them as seen, and they'll disappear from this view. I can always get them back by switching it back to showing all changes. But as long as it's unreviewed, you can switch back and forth between them. There's also a stronger version of that because, of course, because of Usenet, we invented kill files. You can kill changes too. So if you're just like Monty keeps pushing up this annoying change, and I really don't want to, the one that converts tabs to spaces and then back again. I just don't want to see that ever again. I can hit the K key on that and kill it, and Gertty just won't show it to me no matter what. These changes that I've marked as reviewed, if somebody pushes up a new patch set, then Gertty is smart enough to say, oh, well, that you need to look at it again. So they'll show back up again. The killed changes will not. So there are a lot of tools like that to help you, sort of whatever your workflow is, as long as it's reading news groups. Any questions?
Have you used a tool called TIG?
Yes, I have. TIG is like GitK, but for the terminal. So if you're looking at something like this and you're like, wow, I really want this, but just for browsing Git history, then TIG is the tool for you.
Do you know how many users are using Gertty?
I have no idea. Like most open source projects, I only hear from the dissatisfied users, and there are a few of them. So I know that there are at least a few users. I know it does send a user agent string, which is sensible. So you can mine your HTTP logs to find out how many users there are. The last time I did that for OpenStack in aggregate, there was some number larger than 10 and smaller than 200 in the OpenStack community. So if that, I don't know if that helps or not, but those are words related to the question that you asked. Speaking of dissatisfied users, just so that I don't make any more dissatisfied users, one of the things that we learned at the hackathon this week is that there are some special things about the Google source Gerrits. and some parts of Gertty didn't work quite right with them. I have patches that are merged into the master version of into the master branch of the Gertty Git repo that do make it work. I haven't made a release with those patches yet. So if you're interested in using that against that Gerrit, it might be good to run from Git master. It also is a little bit behind in terms of implementing 3.0 features or any greater than 2.13 features. I'm working on making up the deficit there. I added hashtag support during the hackathon because I had to add a hashtag to a change. So that's there now. A few of the newer comments, comment features aren't there yet, and in some cases that might actually cause things like robot comments not to show up. So be aware of that at least until the next release of Gertty, which should have support for all of those things.
Do you have any plans to start supporting NodeDB? Because Gertty could be a fantastic admin tool as well for administrators to understand what is in NodeDB without having Gerrit running.
Yeah.
That is actually an issue. People say, I know migrating with NodeDB because I cannot access the database anymore. But if you got Gertty, you can inspect what is in NodeDB without having a GUI, and that's really great.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea and definitely something that I like to explore. I don't know. I think this is the big experiment, right? This is where when we do that, we're going to find out the unknown knowns or the known unknowns or that sort of thing. It seems pretty straightforward. Gertty is already downloading all of the refs that it knows about, so it ought to be able to download NodeDB refs and parse them and do things with them. Currently, its database is a SQLite database, just because that way it can run locally and not add any. You don't need to do any database administration to run your local review tool. Whether in the future should Gertty read NodeDB information and then stick that into SQLite so that it can do performance queries efficiently? Should it, do something like Lucene? I don't know. Those are all good questions. At least for the foreseeable future, I think making any changes is going to have to go through the REST API, since there isn't a just push a NodeDB ref kind of thing that you would actually allow a normal user to use. But I think perhaps getting to this sort of hybrid state in the near future may be a possibility.